I will give you every penny I own. Just let her live." Bram knelt in the muddy courtyard of the grand manor hall. He was begging for the life of a fallen woman, one who had been beaten, rolled in a filthy coarse sack, and thrown out into the freezing winter snow. To save her, he traded a decade of bone-breaking labor and his life savings for a single sealed parchment, a deed to a cursed, barren crag where not a single blade of grass would grow. The village folk whispered that he was a foolish beast. Yet, when that woman stood upon the barren crag, scooped a handful of the sparse dirt, and tasted it, she smiled radiantly. How did that single smile unravel a massive conspiracy that shook the entire kingdom of England? To keep this humble storyteller's tale alive by the tavern hearth, pray, lend me your ears and your favor. Let this moving tale begin. The stench of rotting grain spills from the Lord's granary once more. Long ago, in the days of old, a dark rumor drifted through a northern shire of England. While commoners starved, digging for bitter roots until they collapsed dead on the muddy roads, the stone granaries of Thorne's estate bulged with harvest, left to rot in the damp. It was the second bitter winter of a great famine. Every morning, wooden carts hauled away the stiff bodies of the poor from the village outskirts. When a starving mother returned from burying her child, weeping and beating her fists against the frozen earth, her cries were so sorrowful that even the village hounds forgot to bark. Yet in that entire parish, only one estate kept its hearth fires roaring and torches blazing through the night. It was the manor of Thorne. If he lent a bushel of wheat to a desperate farmer, he demanded 2 at the next harvest. Through this ruthless usury, the livestock and field deeds of the desperate were swallowed up behind his towering stone walls. Within those imposing walls, a tragic and fateful bond between a man and a woman was about to begin. In the cold, drafty servants' quarters of that terrifying estate lived a man named Bram. He was an orphan of unknown blood, possessing neither father nor mother. Left at the manor gates as a wailing babe, he was taken in by Giles, the old manor servant, and raised to be a beast of burden for the estate. "Bram, if you are to fetch the timber and cross the ridge, you must make haste before the sun dips." At Giles' single word, Bram hoisted the heavy wooden frame onto his back without a complaint. With hands as large as iron skillets, he effortlessly lifted a load of logs that would have made 2 grown men stagger. His skin was weathered and dark, his shoulders broad as a mountain, and he stood so tall his head brushed the lowest branches of the village oak tree. He spoke very little. Because he kept his mouth shut and worked from dawn until dusk, the village gossips swore he was a mute. There goes the foolish bear to the woods again. All muscle, not a whit of sense in his head. Even as the mockery rained upon his broad back, Bram merely climbed the woodland path in silence. He had worked himself to the bone his entire life, yet all he had to show for it were a worn wool tunic and a pair of tattered leather shoes. In truth, he was a man who owned nothing, living day to day at the mercy of a cruel master's whim. But Bram possessed one undeniable trait. If he saw a hound with a broken leg on the castle road, he could not simply walk past. If a starving orphan hovered near the manor bakehouse, he would quietly slip them his own meager ration of coarse barley bread. Beneath his rough, giant exterior beat the warmest heart in the Shire. That was Bram. Then, one bitter afternoon, a wooden cart rolled into the manor courtyard. Word spread quickly that she was a woman sold into servitude by the crown's magistrate. As the woman stepped down from the cart, the manor servants collectively held their breath. She had a pale, bloodless face and sorrowful eyes. Though her linen gown was coarse and shabby, she carried herself with a grace utterly unlike the other servant women. She stood there like a solitary white rose blooming fiercely on a dead winter branch. "What is your name?" Thorn glared down at her from his stone steps with piercing, cruel eyes. "Elise, my lord." Her voice was soft, but it did not tremble. By the stables, Bram, who had been splitting heavy oak logs, found his axe halting mid-swing. How could a woman of such noble bearing be sold into bondage? For reasons he could not explain, a strange chill gripped Bram's heart. From that day on, Elise was placed in the coldest, darkest corner of the servants' quarters. Bram did not know it then, but this woman would soon shake the very foundations of his destiny. Following her arrival, a small change took root in Bram's daily routine. Whenever he passed the stone well, his heavy footsteps naturally slowed. There, he could see the back of Elise as she scrubbed the manor's linens in the freezing water until her delicate hands were raw and red. He himself did not understand why he lingered, but there were other, darker eyes watching her upon the estate. A few of the manor guards and stable hands would leer at Elise's graceful form, licking their lips like hungry wolves. Whenever Bram witnessed this, his massive hands gripped his axe handle tight enough to splinter the wood. One evening, as Bram was unloading the day's firewood into the courtyard, a voice called out, "Pray, a moment." Elise approached and began to sift carefully through the pile of branches and brush. Her pale, slender fingers plucked a pale root from the dirt. "Is this not a healing herb?" Bram stared blankly at her. What his eyes saw only as a useless forest weed, she had recognized instantly. "The barren crag behind the village?" she asked softly. "Have you ever walked its soil?" At her sudden question, Bram had no answer. Why would a lowly servant woman care about a cursed pile of rocks? The question buried itself deep in his chest. A few nights later, in the dead of night, Thorn summoned Elise to his private chambers. With a face flushed red from heavy ale, the Lord reached out to grab her. Elise took a firm step back. "My body may be bound to this manor, but my spirit remains that of a noblewoman." Her voice was quiet, but sharp as a steel blade. Thorn's face twisted in ugly fury. The next morning, a scream rang out across the courtyard. Elise was accused of stealing a silver heirloom brooch. Without a chance to defend herself, she was dragged into the freezing mud, rolled into a coarse sack, and beaten mercilessly. With every strike of the rod, Bram's hands shook violently as he chopped wood nearby. He gripped the axe handle so tightly his palms bled, but as a lowly peasant, he dared not intervene. That night, half dead and stripped of her dignity, Elise was thrown out into the freezing winter woods without a single cloak to her name. Lying in the corner of the servants' quarters, Bram could not close his eyes. The thought of Elise freezing to death in the black woods tore at his chest. Bram was a man who had never once defied a master's command in his entire life. For a servant to disobey a lord was not merely losing a place to sleep. It was a swift sentence to the gallows. Yet, Bram laced up his worn leather boots. I may be a low-born beast of burden, but how can I turn a blind eye while a person dies? Muttering to himself, Bram slipped out of the grand gates in the dead of night. Piercing the biting wind, he climbed the mountain path. Before an hour had passed, he spotted a small, frail shadow collapsed in the snow. "Milady, wake up!" Elise's body was already as cold as ice. Bram immediately stripped off his heavy wool tunic and wrapped it tightly around her. Lifting her body, which felt as light as a feather, he carried her deep into the woods toward an abandoned timber cottage. The moment he turned his back on the manor gates, Bram knew the truth. He was now an outlaw. Upon reaching the crumbling cottage, cold sweat poured down Bram's face. Elise's breathing was growing dangerously shallow. Her lips had turned a sickly blue, and her fingers and toes were frozen stiff, devoid of feeling. Bram frantically stoked a fire in the hearth and boiled water in a rusted iron pot, pacing in terror. Just then, barely conscious, Elise parted her lips. Outside, beneath the frost, there is a withered vine and a pale root. I beg you. Bram tore back out into the pitch-black woods. Digging through the freezing snow with his bare hands, he found the exact herbs she had described. When he returned with a handful of the roots, Elise took them with trembling fingers and prepared them. As she drank the boiling, bitter brew from a wooden bowl, a miracle occurred. The color slowly began to return to her pale cheeks, pulling her back from the threshold of death. Bram could only stand there, his mouth agape, watching the spectacle. How do you possess such knowledge of healing herbs? Elise offered no answer, only a faint, weary smile. A few days later, having regained her strength, Elise knelt before him on the dirt floor of the cottage. You have saved my life twice over. This is a debt I could not repay in 100 lifetimes. Pray, let me remain by your side. Bram waved his massive hands in a panic. How could a woman as fine as a high-born lady serve a lowly brute like him? But the eyes looking up at him held such pure, unwavering sincerity that words failed him entirely. By the warm glow of the hearth fire, two shadows gently merged into one. In that poor, drafty timber cottage, an unlikely bond took root. The next morning, Thorne's estate was in an absolute uproar. Word had spread that the peasant Bram had stolen the condemned slave woman. Thorne himself, flanked by armed manor guards, stormed up the woodland path and kicked open the door to the timber cottage. "Bram, you dog! You dare betray your master?" Dragged out into the freezing mud, Bram knelt, but for the first time in his life, he did not bow his head. Within his dark eyes, there was no longer fear, but something entirely different. My lord, I have bled for your estate for 10 long years. Keep every penny of my unpaid wages. Take it all as the price for her freedom. I beg you, Release me and let her go." Thorn threw his head back and barked a cruel laugh. "A peasant daring to bargain? And over a worthless, dying slave woman at that." But as his laughter faded, a cunning gleam flashed in the wealthy lord's eyes. "Very well. I shall grant you both freedom, but I do not give it away for free. You shall buy this parchment." Thorn reached into his heavy velvet cloak and pulled out a yellowed, sealed deed. It was the deed to the barren crag at the edge of the parish, a cursed hill of jagged stone where not a blade of grass grew, a place no man wanted. "I will take your 10 years of wages for this land, and I will throw in her writ of freedom. Do we have a bargain?" A chorus of mocking laughter erupted from the manor guards standing in the mud. 10 years of bone-breaking sweat traded for a pile of useless rocks. It was akin to trading a lifetime's fortune for a patch of barren swamp. Yet, swallowing his humiliation, Bram reached out with both hands and took the parchment. His hands trembled violently, but deep within his chest, a strange and powerful emotion swelled. For the first time in his miserable life, this man who had belonged to everyone else finally held a piece of the world in his own name. Bram took Elise by the hand and led her to the crag. Upon arriving at the rocky hill, a heavy sigh escaped Bram's lips. It was exactly as the rumors said. It was no place for the living. Black stones jutted from the earth like the spines of wild boars, and the soil was entirely too thin to plow. "Milady, forgive me. I traded 10 years of sweat for a graveyard of stones. I truly am a foolish beast." As Bram hung his broad shoulders in despair, Elise slowly knelt upon the jagged ground. She scooped a handful of the sparse dirt and, to Bram's horror, placed a pinch of it on her tongue. Bram cried out in shock and tried to pull her hand away. "Milady, what are you doing? Do not eat the dirt." But as she tasted the earth, a radiant smile spread across Elise's face. It was a smile so bright and full of hope that Bram found himself holding his breath. "This land is not cursed." Elise began to point across the rocky hill. She traced the slopes with her finger, pointing out the deep green moss, the damp soil flanking the valley, and the faint trace of water-seeking flora below. Through the study of botany she had learned by her noble father's side, Elise could read the soil in a way no commoner could. To her eyes, the land was not dead. It was a fertile earth, a place where hidden underground springs gathered into a single potent basin. If they merely cleared the surface stones, she explained, the richest, darkest soil in all the realm lay slumbering beneath. Bram simply stood there with his mouth agape, listening to her words. He did not understand half of what she spoke of, but one thing was entirely clear to him. The woman he loved saw a world that a lowly peasant like him would never be able to witness. That very night, in front of the warm hearth fire of their timber cottage, the two quietly bound their lives together. There was no parish priest to bless them, nor a grand church wedding. Yet the shadows of the two people cast against the wall by the firelight looked stronger and more steadfast than any grand betrothal ceremony. From that day on, Their mornings began with the morning star. Bram used his massive, shovel-like hands to carry the stones. He hoisted boulders as large as a man onto his broad shoulders and rolled them down the hill. Elise followed behind him, carefully sorting and planting the seeds of rare herbs. The sweat flowing down their backs froze in the bitter wind, blooming into white crusts of salt on their wool clothes. But neither of them ever uttered a word of complaint. When evening came, a small tallow candle would be lit inside the timber cottage. Elise would soak a linen cloth in warm herbal water and gently wash Bram's calloused, hardened hands. Blood and dirt were caked into every cracked crevice of his skin. "My lord, how did your hands come to be in such pain?" Moisture gathered in Elise's eyes. Bram merely offered a foolish, warm smile in return. His heart swelled with a burning heat, for he knew those hands had grown rough only to provide for her. One spring morning, on his way down from the hills, Bram snapped off a branch of wild hawthorn that had just begun to bloom. The red petals were so beautiful that he simply could not bear to leave it behind. He approached Elise, who was hanging washed linens by the door of their cottage, and with his rough hands, he gently tucked the blooming branch into her coif. "I thought it would suit you, milady." Elise's cheeks flushed a deep crimson. Looking at the hawthorn flowers in Elise's hair by the hearth fire, a bright spring bloomed within Bram's heart as well. However, Bram harbored a thorn-like worry in his mind. Whenever he looked at Elise's beautiful, sleeping profile, a corner of his chest ached with a cold sorrow. How did such a refined woman end up living with a lowly peasant like him? Was he not a man entirely unworthy of her? Unable to extinguish the candle, Bram would toss and turn alone night after night. By the height of summer, a terrible famine and drought struck the region. For 3 long months, not a single drop of rain fell from the sky. The once fertile manor fields of thorn cracked like the shell of a dried turtle, and not even a puddle of muddy water could be found in the village wells. The wailing of the commoners echoed at the edge of the medieval village once more. "The Lord in heaven has abandoned us." The sight of the starving peasants weeping and beating the dry earth was enough to break anyone's heart. But a truly miraculous thing occurred, and it happened upon that very rocky hill everyone had called cursed. At a specific spot halfway up the mountain, a place Elise had pinpointed through her botanical knowledge, Bram struck the ground with his pickaxe. Almost instantly, cold, crystal-clear spring water began to gush forth. The herbs and vegetables the two had tended with such devotion drank the sweet water and grew lush and green, even in the midst of the deadly drought. It was as if, in a village where everyone was perishing, they alone had struck a holy well and survived. However, this miracle soon became a source of misfortune. Starving peasants began to flock to the rocky hill, one by one. "I beg of you, please, just one bowl of water." Bram could not bring himself to turn them away. He, too, was a man who had known the gnawing pain of starvation. Elise boiled thin broth with the herbs she had prepared and shared it with the desperate souls. But nothing travels faster than the tongues of men. Within a few days, the village gossip reached the ears of Thorn behind the high walls of his manor hall. "What did you say?" That foolish beast is farming on the rocky hill? Thorn's eyes flashed with a cold, venomous blue. The realization that green shoots were sprouting from the useless wasteland he had tossed away caused the old landowner's greed to writhe once more.
It happened one afternoon.
While Elise was working the soil with her hoe between the furrows, something slipped from the folds of her linen gown and fell to the dirt. Catching the sunlight, it gleamed with a brilliant silver luster. Bram, who was carrying stones nearby, picked it up. What is this? Resting on Bram's massive palm was an exquisite silver pendant bearing a noble crest. The kind of fine jewelry only the daughters of high-born knights and lords would carry. Even a lowly peasant like Bram could tell at a glance how precious it was. A single blooming rose was intricately engraved into the silver. Elise's face turned completely white. But soon, as if making a firm resolve, she knelt on the ground and looked up at Bram. "My lord, I believe it is time I told you everything." With a trembling voice, Elise began to confess her true identity. "My true family name is not known here. My father was Stanton, a great nobleman who stood beside the king's own council in the capital." Bram nearly dropped the silver pendant. Stanton? Was that not the great lord who had been falsely accused of treason during the bloody purges at the royal court a few years ago and sentenced to death? The rumors that his entire household had been stripped of their titles and sold into slavery had reached even the ears of a remote manor servant like Bram. "My father was never a traitor," Elise wept. "He was unjustly condemned by the deceit of his political rivals. My mother died of a broken heart, and my young siblings were scattered to the winds. I do not even know if they draw breath." Heavy tears streamed down Elise's cheeks. Bram stood in silence for a long time. His heart felt as though it were being torn into 1,000 pieces. His wife was in truth the daughter of a great nobleman. He had spent his nights fearing he was unworthy of her, and now he learned his fears were entirely true. But his hesitation was only fleeting. Bram reached down and pulled the kneeling Elise to her feet. "Whether you are a noble lady or a low-born slave, to me, you are simply my wife. I will protect you with my very life." Elise buried her face in Bram's broad, rough chest and sobbed. That night, the bond between the two grew even stronger. From that day forward, Bram changed. For the first time in his life, he felt ashamed of being a man who only knew how to use brute strength. He realized that to protect a wife who was a noblewoman, fists as big as iron pots would never be enough. "Milady, I have a request." One evening, Bram sat properly before the hearth fire and bowed his head to Elise. "Please, teach me how to read the letters. I fear that as a blind, ignorant man, I will not be able to properly protect the one person who belongs to me." Elise smiled brightly and brought out a piece of parchment and a quill. From that day on, the candlelight in the timber cottage did not go out until the early hours of the morning. By day, he moved stones and harvested herbs. By night, he memorized the alphabet and read the parish scholars' texts. The sight of his massive, shovel-like hand gripping a slender quill was so awkward that Elise could not help but burst into laughter. "My lord, it looks as though the quill will snap in your grasp." Bram chuckled. "Good heavens, Why is this little feather heavier than an axe handle? He was nearly 40 years old, starting his letters for the first time. Yet Bram's mind was by no means dull. On the contrary, the sharp instincts he had honed by tracking forest beasts in the woods translated brilliantly to his studies. Letters were not the only thing Bram learned. He also learned how to bypass Thorn entirely and trade the rare herbs harvested from the rocky hill directly with the merchant guilds. He learned how to calculate the market prices and negotiate without bowing his head to the seasoned merchants who traveled from the capital. I know full well that the price for this rare herb in the capital is over 5 silver shillings. But if you do not meet that price, I shall take my goods to another guildmaster. The merchant was astounded. How did a man he assumed to be an ignorant peasant become so sharp with market prices? But this was the very image of Bram being reborn as a true man and the strong head of a household. It was late autumn. Elise had used her botanical knowledge to pinpoint a new location. It was a small, sunken hollow located in the deepest part of the hills, right where the dampest shadows faced each other. Elise pointed to the spot, her voice trembling. "My lord, that place is the very heart of this land. It is the center of the fertile earth." Bram took his pickaxe and began to dig exactly where Elise had pointed. 1 foot, 2 feet, 3 feet. The soil gradually turned a deep, rich red. Then, at a certain moment, the tip of the pickaxe struck something solid with a dull thud. Is something there? Bram carefully brushed the dirt away, and in the next moment, the two of them froze in place. Emerging from the soil were massive fungi, as thick as a man's fingers, buried in a row, as if a family were lying down holding hands, were none other than ancient royal truffles, the most miraculous healing fungi known to the realm. And it was not just 1 or 2, a whole cluster of rare truffles, undisturbed for hundreds of years, lay slumbering there. Elise's hands trembled slightly. "My lord, this is no ordinary mountain. It is a forgotten truth, but this rocky hill was originally a secret royal estate, a lost botanical garden where the king's own physicians harvested rare panaceas. But a great earthquake changed the landscape many years ago, and it was entirely forgotten by the minds of men. Even Thorn had simply tossed it away, thinking it was a useless piece of land where not a single blade of grass could grow. It was as if someone had handed over a muddy ditch, only for the new owner to discover a vein of solid gold beneath the muck. Bram carefully lifted one of the truffles with his massive hands. The weight of a single ancient truffle was so heavy it felt like the heaviest burden he had ever carried in his life. It was the moment a poor peasant couple had suddenly acquired enough wealth to be counted among the richest in all of England. However, Bram did not know. He did not realize that this heavy wealth would soon become a weight that threatened to crush both of their lives. A few days later, Bram set out on the castle road toward the capital to sell the ancient royal truffle to the merchant guild. Because the medicine was so rare and precious, he could not simply entrust it to a local village merchant. He had to go directly to the seasoned merchant guildmaster, who occasionally came down from the capital to trade goods. Before leaving, Bram held Elise's hands tightly. "I will return within 5 days. Please keep yourself safe until then." Elise placed her silver pendant into Bram's tunic. It was like a charm, a prayer that the two of them would safely meet again. But on the very night Bram left, the flickering light of torches danced in the yard of the timber cottage.
Thorn had stormed the property, leading 10 armed manor guards. Where is that wretched woman?
As it turned out, Thorn had planted spies near the rocky hill all along. The vegetable patches growing green in the midst of the drought. Bram trading with the capital's merchant guild. Everything had flowed through the mouths of those spies and straight into the manor hall. And the final, decisive piece of news was the discovery of the cluster of ancient royal truffles deep in the mountains. A lowly peasant dares to steal the wealth I have spent my entire life building, and on the very land I gave him? Thorn's eyes were bloodshot with madness. The manor guards tore the timber cottage apart and dragged Elise out into the muddy yard. A cold blue steel blade was pressed against her slender neck. If we hold this wench hostage, that beast will have no choice but to return. Elise clenched her jaw. Anger burned hotter in her chest than fear. Yet, as the manor guards dragged her through the mud, all she could do was pray to the Almighty for Bram to return safely. A few days later, on his journey back from the distant merchant city, Bram saw the rocky hill from afar. His heart sank like a stone in a deep well. No smoke rose from the chimney of their timber cottage. He abandoned his wooden cart and ran up the steep mountain path with all the strength in his massive legs. When he reached the muddy yard, he found Thorn's armed guards forming a tight circle. In the center, Elise was forced to her knees, her hands bound, with the cold, blue steel of a broadsword pressed firmly against her slender neck. Thick, angry red veins bulged in Bram's eyes. His giant hands, rough and heavy as iron anvils, curled into tight fists. He had the strength to charge in that very moment and crush the skulls of the manor guards with his bare hands. He was more than capable of tearing them apart. But in that split second, Elise's trembling eyes locked onto his. He understood her silent plea. If he killed the guards here, he would become a murderer, a wanted outlaw. And Elise, if she survived, would be forced to live her entire life as a fugitive's wife. That would only drag her into another kind of hell. Slowly, Bram forced his fists to uncurl. He reached deep inside his heavy wool tunic and pulled out something he had kept carefully hidden. Wrapped in a piece of faded yellow linen was an ancient, massive royal truffle, as thick as a man's forearm. It was the largest and most precious fungus of the entire cluster, the one he had secretly held back, not even showing it to the merchant guild in the city. "Look at this, my lord!" Bram's deep voice echoed as he held the rare medicinal fungus high in the air. Caught in the winter sunlight, the ancient truffle seemed to gleam like solid gold. The manor guard's eyes widened in sheer disbelief, and the loud gulp of Thorn swallowing his own greed echoed in the tense air. "This is a royal truffle, centuries old," Bram said, his voice steady. "This single truffle is more than worthy to be presented at the high table of King Henry himself." Thorn took a greedy step forward, his eyes practically bulging from his skull. Instantly, Bram lowered his arm, hovering his heavy leather boot right over the precious fungus. "Take one more step, and I will crush it into the mud," Bram warned. "It will become nothing but worthless dirt and weeds." Thorn's face twisted in ugly fury. This foolish, silent giant, the peasant he had mocked and worked to the bone for years, now held him completely by the throat. "Let us make a trade, my lord," Bram said, his tone unwavering. "Release my wife. If you let her go unharmed, I will give you this ancient truffle, and I will hand over the sealed parchment deed to the rocky hill. It will all be yours." Even the armed guards standing in the yard could not hide their shock. No one had ever expected such calm, iron-willed negotiation to come from the mouth of a man they thought to be a simple-minded beast of burden. Thorn hesitated for a long moment, his greedy eyes darting between the truffle and the blade at Elise's neck. Finally, a wicked smirk crossed his face, and he nodded. But Bram did not know that behind that nod lay a treacherous trap. The very next morning, the sheriff's deputies stormed the gates of the manor estate. "Bram, the peasant, you are hereby summoned to the sheriff's court on charges of grand thievery." Before he could even comprehend what was happening, Bram was bound tightly in thick hemp ropes. Elise, too, was seized and dragged alongside him. As it turned out, Thorn had merely pretended to honor their agreement. The moment he had the truffle and the deed, he rode straight to Talbot, the corrupt local sheriff, and accused Bram of being a thief. "That low-born peasant stole that precious truffle from my private forest and attempted to sell it behind my back," Thorn had lied smoothly. But Talbot was already blinded by Thorn's heavy bribes. The deputies in the courtyard had all seen the heavy leather pouch of silver coins quietly slip into the folds of the sheriff's velvet cloak. Dragged into the cold stone courtyard of the sheriff's keep, Bram and Elise were forced to kneel on the freezing cobblestones. They could not even raise their heads. "Hear me," Talbot barked from his high wooden chair. "Beat this thieving peasant without mercy, and punish the wretched woman who conspired with him." At the sheriff's command, the heavy wooden stocks and the executioner's block were dragged into the yard. Bram ground his teeth. He did not care if he died, but seeing Elise's frail shoulders trembling violently beside him tore his heart into pieces. "My lord, I beg you to hear the truth," Bram shouted, straining against his ropes. "That land was legally mine. I bought it with my own sweat." But Talbot did not even pretend to listen. Standing off to the side of the courtyard, Thorn wore a dark, victorious smirk. It was the face of a man entirely convinced that the world bent to his wicked will. The executioner stepped forward, slowly raising a gleaming steel broadsword high above Bram's neck. Elise squeezed her eyes shut. She prayed to God that the blade would strike her first. She could not bear to watch the head of the man she had loved with all her soul fall to the cobblestones. Wait! Just as the cold steel was about to descend upon Bram's neck, a thunderous noise shattered the morning air. The heavy iron gates of the sheriff's keep groaned and violently swung open. A group of stern-faced men in royal livery marched into the courtyard with heavy, commanding strides. "Halt! In the name of the crown! The royal inspector is here!" The booming shout rattled the stone walls of the keep. The man leading the charge held up a heavy gold medallion stamped with the royal seal, gleaming fiercely in the morning sun. Talbot's face instantly drained of all color, turning a sickly pale blue. Thorn's arrogant smirk vanished entirely. Every deputy, guard, and servant in the courtyard immediately dropped to their knees in terror. Bound by his ropes, Bram slowly raised his head to look at the man holding the royal seal. The face was strikingly familiar, yet it took him a moment to realize where he had seen him before. The royal inspector's name was Arthur. He lowered the golden seal and walked slowly toward Bram. Bram's eyes widened in utter disbelief. Beneath the fine velvet cloak of a high-ranking royal official, he recognized the very same merchant guildmaster he had traded with in the city just days ago. "Look at me, good man," Arthur said gently. "You tried to sell your royal truffle to a guildmaster in the capital, did you not? I was that guildmaster." Bram's jaw dropped. The man he had believed to be a simple, wealthy apothecary merchant was, in truth, an undercover royal inspector sent by the crown to observe the struggles of the common folk. The ancient royal truffle Bram had brought to the city was of such miraculous quality that it was destined straight for the royal apothecaries. "The truffle you brought to the city was no ordinary find," Arthur explained, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "I traveled here to this parish myself to verify the origin of such a magnificent treasure. I never expected to find such wicked corruption taking place over it." At Arthur's sharp command, the royal guards immediately seized Talbot and Thorn, binding them in heavy iron chains. Talbot threw himself onto the muddy cobblestones, begging and trembling like a cornered rat. Thorn's face had turned as white as a corpse. Arthur had not been idle during his time disguised in the region. He had thoroughly investigated every corner of the parish. The exorbitant interest Thorn charged the starving peasants, the brutal theft of the villagers, farmlands, the heavy bribes paid to the sheriff to lock away innocent men. Every single crime was meticulously recorded on the heavy parchment scroll Arthur now held in his hand. Then Arthur's sharp gaze shifted. It landed on Elise, who was still kneeling quietly in the dirt. His eyes wavered with sudden emotion. "My lady, are you not the daughter of Lord Stanton?" Elise slowly raised her head to look at the powerful inspector. Through the haze of memory, she recalled a young, earnest parish scholar who used to study in her father's grand library many years ago. It was Arthur. "I am, my lord," Elise whispered, thick, heavy tears spilling from her eyes. Arthur stood in silence for a long moment before he spoke, his voice thick with respect. "Milady, the royal court in the capital has been overturned once more. The truth has come to light. The false accusations against your family have been entirely cleared by the crown. Lord Stanton's honor is fully restored. Your father is no longer considered a traitor to the realm." Elise's shoulders collapsed as she sobbed, the weight of a decade of suffering pouring out of her. Bram desperately tried to pull at his bound hands, wanting nothing more than to hold his weeping wife. A few days later, a massive upheaval swept through the parish. The corrupt sheriff, Talbot, was stripped of his title, his lands, and his dignity, and was dragged away to the capital in heavy iron chains to face the king's justice. Thorn had his entire vast fortune confiscated by the crown and was banished to the freezing, desolate northern borders for the rest of his miserable life. The grand iron gates of the manor hall were firmly locked. One by one, the oppressed villagers began to reclaim the fertile fields that had been stolen from them. The calves and sheep that had been taken to pay off impossible winter debts were returned to the humble barns of their rightful owners. For the first time in years, genuine, bright laughter echoed outside the manor walls. The heavy, suffocating dread they had lived under for so long seemed to melt away like winter snow. But there was still one tangled knot left to untie. With her family's honor restored, Elise was legally recognized as a noblewoman of high birth once again. And according to the strict laws of medieval England, it was absolutely forbidden for a lady of noble blood to be married to a low-born peasant who had once been a servant. "My love, what are we to do?" Elise's voice trembled by the hearth one evening. Bram could not speak a word. The very thing he had feared his entire life had finally come to pass. The law of the land now declared that he was a man entirely unworthy of the woman he loved. But Elise was not a woman who surrendered easily to fate. She traveled straight to the grand castle in the capital and knelt before the throne of Henry, the King of England. "Your Grace," Elise pleaded, her voice ringing clear and true through the great hall. The ancient royal truffle that was presented to the royal court was pulled from the earth by the hands of my husband, Bram. He found that miraculous fungus on a barren, rocky hill, land he purchased fairly with 10 years of his own blood, sweat, and labor. I beg of you, my king, let the honor and reward for this discovery fall rightfully to him." King Henry listened to the entire remarkable tale of the giant peasant and the fallen noblewoman. The king was deeply moved by their unwavering devotion. Right then and there, King Henry made his royal decree. Let the man named Bram be forever freed from his low-born status. In recognition of his loyalty, his honest labor, and his great service to the crown, I hereby grant him a lordship and an estate. A few days later, a royal messenger arrived at the humble timber cottage on the mountain, bearing a sealed parchment with the king's own crest. Bram's massive hands shook as he held it. The man who had been born in the dirt, who believed he would die as nothing more than a beast of burden, had been elevated to the ranks of the nobility. At last, before God and the law of the realm, Bram and Elise were recognized as a proud, honorable husband and wife. A gentle spring breeze rustled through the branches outside the cottage. A year passed, and spring returned to the mountain, bringing the sweet scent of blooming white winter roses. The rocky hill was no longer a cursed, barren wasteland. In its place stood a magnificent stone manor with a grand timber hall, surrounded by lush gardens where the white roses bloomed in wild abundance. The villagers called the estate the Silver Dragon, for it was a sanctuary built on the hidden strength of a dormant beast that had finally awakened. Though Bram had been granted a noble title, he refused to move to the capital. He believed the best thing he could do was stay on his land and protect the common folk. The rare herbs and medicines grown on the Silver Dragon estate were sold to the poor for mere pennies. Whenever a starving beggar or a wandering orphan came to their gates, Bram threw the heavy doors of his granary wide open. The parish that had once been defined by the rotting grain inside Thorne's greedy manor had now become the most generous and prosperous lands in all of England. One quiet evening, a warm fire crackled in the great stone hearth. Bram now wore fine linen and soft wool, but his hands remained as rough and calloused as they had always been. Just as she had done in their poorest days, Elise dipped a linen cloth into a basin of warm herbal water and gently washed his massive hands. "Milady, you must stop doing this," Bram said softly, a tender smile on his face. Why would the lady of a great estate perform such a humble task every single day? "Because, my lord," Elise replied, her eyes shining in the firelight, "this is my favorite time of the day." Pinned carefully in Elise's hair was the same withered branch of wild hawthorn Bram had given to her so long ago. The two sat by the fire, looking at each other, sharing a quiet, knowing smile. To them, the lingering scent of earth and healing herbs on Bram's rough, scarred hands was a treasure far more precious than all the fine silk and gold in the world. And so ends our tale. When faced with the towering, cruel walls of social class and birthright, the honest, the unyielding hands of a giant peasant, and the quiet, resilient wisdom of a noblewoman forged a bond that no law or greed could break. It was their sweat that turned a cursed, rocky mountain into a paradise. But the true treasure, buried deep within that earth, was the pure, unwavering love they held for one another. The elders of the village still tell this story by the hearth on cold winter nights, reminding us all of a timeless truth. It is not the fine clothes or the noble titles that make a person great, but the courage and kindness hidden within their heart. This old folk tale, passed down through the ages, has been woven anew to warm your spirit. May the loyalty and love within it stay with you always. And indeed, the noble heart that looks past the ragged wool of a commoner to see a person for who they truly are is the very truth our ancestors have long held dear and passed down through the ages. As the embers of our fire burn low, I wish to quietly ask you a question to ponder, dear listener. What if Bram had hesitated on that bitter winter night, his spirit too broken by a lifetime of servitude to defy the cruel orders of the greedy Lord Thorn? What would have become of his beautiful bond with the wise Elise? Would she have perished alone in the unforgiving snow? And would he have remained nothing more than a silent, giant beast of burden until his dying day, never knowing the warmth of true love or the pride of a free man? And you, my unseen friends, who are sharing in the magic of this tale with me now, in what distant lands do you reside? Do you hail from the warm, sunlit shires of the south, where the wheat grows tall? Or do you dwell in the bitter, wind-swept mountain valleys, where the winter frost bites deep into the bone? If you would gladly share your origins and thoughts with me, sending word as though we were sitting together around a crackling hearth, sharing friendly gossip and warm ale, your words would serve as a bright, guiding lantern for the weaving of my next tale. If this old folk tale of love and justice has touched your heart, I humbly ask that you do not forget to bestow your favor upon it and pledge your continued support to this storyteller. Every small gesture of kindness from you becomes the gentle spring breeze that breathes life into the cold ashes of history, allowing our forgotten tales to bloom once more. I sincerely hope you spend your days as peacefully as a quiet morning in a sunlit abbey garden. May peace and prosperity always dwell within your household. May all your beloved family members remain in sturdy health. and may you spend your days filled with boundless joy, where the sweet music of laughter never leaves your hearth. I wish this for you from the very bottom of my heart.